All right. I think I'm good to go.
Yeah, I'm recording.
Nice. Welcome everybody to episode 65 of the You Can't Comp This NBA Trading Card Podcast. We're your hosts, Adam, Amy, and Russell Gibson. And today we are joined by Ryan Stuczynski from GemRate. Ryan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, and you nailed the name. I appreciate that.
Thank you. I was a bit nervous then. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to say it wrong. I knew this was going to happen. But yeah, no, thanks heaps. We do use your data a lot. We retweet a lot of it. And yeah, it's just nice to sort of put a face to a Twitter tag, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. And yeah, I've been listening for the last few months since I sort of discovered what you guys were doing. And I appreciate it. You know, the NBA focus is nice. And it's also, we're so U.S. centric and things that we do out here. It's nice to have, another perspective on it. So I appreciate what you guys have been doing.
Yeah, interesting. So from my end of the world, it's almost like there's nothing else but NBA. So when you look at GemRate and the hobby, where do you sort of look at it from? Like, what's your interest in that space?
I got back into cards, really into basketball, but then baseball sort of has also been a big part of my sort of, sort of resurfacing in the hobby. And so baseball is actually, in baseball, when you look at sort of the GemRate data, is actually the category besides like TCG, which is like Pokemon and stuff, that's been doing the best over the last 6 months. They've had a lot of releases and stuff. So anyways, baseball has been really interesting to look at. Football has ebbs and flows sort of with the season. Basketball's kind of like pretty constant throughout this whole thing. But anyways, yeah, those are the main ones.
Can you please tell us about what GemRate is? And the other thing I'm interested to hear from you two in this sort of same sort of pass is, how did you get to GemRate, or what projects you worked on before you?
Now, before we go any further with this, but Ryan, we did about a year ago. I think I was whinging about pop reports. Now, this isn't a year-old project. You weren't listening to an episode where I was complaining about regulation of the hobby and consolidating data, were you?
I did not. I don't think so, but you never know. I listened to a lot of clips, a lot of stuff. It may have sort of been another seed planted that helped push me forward on this. But no, I started this GemRate a couple years ago.
Yep.
And
that was my guess. You've been doing it for about 3 years.
Yeah, I started sort of the idea. I had initial discussions with people in the space in like December of what it was at 2020, I guess.
Okay.
Because I got back into cards again, like everybody else, in the middle of the pandemic, or sort of the start of the pandemic.
Yeah.
I was just frustrated with like navigating pop reports. I spent a lot of money, and I was, one of the things I was doing as I got back into cards, I'm like, how do I optimize sort of like my collection? Are there certain places I should get cards graded? Are there certain cards that are better received at certain grading companies? Are there certain, just like it's not. There was a lot of nuance, and then I started to dive into the pop reports, and it's awesome that the data was out there and existed in a public forum, but it was really hard to make sense of. And I had to answer your question before that, I was doing some work with like aggregating data prior to this. I had done a project. Mm-hmm. I've grown up in fantasy sports for my whole life. I was in fantasy sports in 1990. My dad and I would do fantasy football where we would fax in our lineups, and we didn't know if we won or lost in a given week until like 3 days after the games ended. Because
is this where you had to get the newspaper out and actually calculate what was going on and say, now that is fantasy football? We did that with our national game here. We had fantasy leagues. That's where I got started. It's fantastic.
Oh yeah, I loved it. And so it was like my introduction to like data and sports, and then cards was like right in tandem with that. But I've always had sort of this love for just data and sports. And so I was doing a project just as I had worked at a startup for like 7 or 8 years prior to this, 2 different startups in analytics and growth, which is basically growth marketing, which is a function of just having really good data to understand your audience, understand, where do you find more people like that. And I took a step back from that in 2018. I was just like, I'd like to sort of cut my teeth on more technical projects that I was working on. Yeah. And so I started to do stuff in daily fantasy sports where I was aggregating different projections for the NBA. The NBA is really subject to changes around the lineup in any given moment. And so if you have really good data at sort of the last possible moment, you can sort of optimize your sort of fantasy sports lineups. And so I was just pulling in data from a bunch of different sites and sort of allowing myself to sort of at the last moment put together like an optimal lineup. I don't tell the story too often, but I won $100K on DraftKings using that technique. And so between that and I sort of had a very like small, modest exit from a startup I was working at, I was like, okay, I have enough sort of flexibility here to just sort of spend a couple years building something I'm interested in without it
Yeah,
sort of like
wow.
really killing my funds. And so
Yeah.
that was sort of the the impetus or sort of the jumping off point. And I had actually worked on another project in finance for like 6 months prior to GemRate, but then I just got swept up in the card stuff, and I was like, it's the perfect combination of like I used to work in banking for 7, 8 years in New York prior to that, so I have a finance background and I have a data background,
Okay.
and then the card side of it was just it's like my sweet spot of like, oh wait, I can do the sports stuff and I can sort of think about it through the lens of collecting and
That
investing and all these other things.
that makes so much sense what you just said to me. Like this project, it just that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Yeah.
And just
Yeah, and
encompasses
that's
all
part of
of
why
your, yeah.
it's part of why it was so appealing. It was like a perfect combination of like stuff that I had done as a career plus
Yeah.
stuff I was dabbling with from just like a technical standpoint. And so I was just like, okay, this is a good place to cut my teeth.
And you're
And
genuinely
candidly,
interested in it too, I think, and that sort of personal investment piece. Like, yeah, yeah,
yeah, this would
yeah,
never have sort of kept going if I didn't care about the industry and sort of the data because
yeah,
it's a lot of work and I wasn't monetizing it until very recently. And so, it was
Yeah.
just 2 years of grunt work and, my own sort of cost sort of being absorbed here and sort of, just self-funding this project. So yeah, I definitely had to have like a strong interest in it, which I did.
yeah,
And just like a strong desire for this to sort of data to be available in a way that it just didn't exist at the time.
yeah. And this is probably a question that is a bit further down the sheet. Actually, no, I'll save that for later. Because tell us about what GemRate is, because I don't think you really dived into that just then.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So the idea was, I kind of initially pitched it as like population reports on steroids, which just like how can you sort of do more with pop reports? The pop reports were sort of like the basic function that the grading companies were putting out there, which was here's how many cards, here's how many each grade exists for every card in our population, essentially.
yeah,
But there were none of these were really built with the idea of um, complex analyses. You can't get the data out of the tools to do. You can't export the data. So you're even copying and pasting the data was really painful out of a lot of these tools. You can't really do great sorting and filtering for most of these tools. I mean, they've improved in the last couple of years. So to their credit, they're not like not paying attention to them. But there's just things that I wanted to do where it's like, oh, I want to look at all kabooms over time, and it's really hard to look at 9 years or 8 years worth of data in those tools. And so if I were able to sort of pull it in, so anyways, the idea was to just collect the data, not necessarily take away from what the pop reports are doing, but be additive to it and allow you to just do things you couldn't do on the pop reports as they exist today,
Yeah.
or existed back then. And so it's really just a way to much more easily navigate pop reports in a more uniform sort of standardized way because every grading company has their sort of own opinion on their pop report too, and they just look very different. And so this allows you to sort of see data in a consistent fashion.
yeah.
And that's sort of like how it's existed. And I've been doing the content for about a year and a half where I publish, the transparent. I just thought there was, PSA had sort of emerged as this sort of like behemoth in the space, but like there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unknowns around grading activity.
Yeah.
They weren't publishing stats. Nobody was really publishing stats about the grading industry. And so there was a lot of question marks around what this backlog that they had accumulated looked like, what a shutdown across the different services might do for the industry. And so I had this idea of if I sort of take a snapshot of what the population report looks like every day or at the beginning of a period of time and I compare it to another period of time, I could sort of triangulate what has happened over that period of time.
Yeah,
And
right.
so if you look at it, for example, at the start of a month and then the end of a month, you kind of see what worked its way through the system. And so that allowed me to sort of say, okay, for each one of these companies, specifically PSA, but then I started to bring on Beckett and SGC and CSG and CGC, it allowed you to see just what activity they're seeing on their end. So, what does it look like on a month-to-month basis? Are there certain categories within each grader that are sort of outperforming or sort of people are gravitating towards? So, GemRate sort of the population report is sort of the site functionality, which is very basic and sort of how it works today. And then we're best known today for our content, which is more around here are sort of industry trends that we're publishing, which has been really well received because again, it's just bringing more transparency to the space. And generally speaking, the grading companies themselves have sort of signed off and said it's not 100% perfect with how we track data internally, but it's generally representative of like the trends that we're seeing. And so, most of them have signed off at this stage and said, now the GemRate data is pretty reliable
Yeah.
and can be used in sort of as a proxy for overall trends. So that's sort of like where we stand today, or sort of like what we're known for.
So without going too much into the back end, but how do you make sure that that data is reliable? Like, do they give you their sort of back end data, or do you need to mine it yourself, or how does that sort of work? Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a pretty strong sort of philosophy or sort of approach to this in the sense of I only like to use what's publicly available because I want to be able to explain what's happened, and I also don't want to be fed data that I can't sort of verify. And so
Yeah.
everything I pull is from the pop report, and that's sort of been my philosophy with this from the start, which is if everybody else sees the same data, then they can verify it themselves. They can also sort of go deeper into the data. If I'm getting data specifically from the companies, I can't verify it. And also, there's risk of somebody sort of feeding me data that tells a story that they want to be told. And that
Yeah, definitely.
I can't,
Yeah.
again, I can't sort of, check against that. So it's all pulled from the population reports. I don't receive anything specific from any company. I do talk to them in the sense of, hey, there's something odd about the pop report. Are you guys doing some updates on your side? Are there things to be considering?
Yeah.
But everything comes from the pop reports at this stage.
Yeah, I would have assumed you'd have some type of working relationship with them because, I would assume they would want you to have the right data, and, you would want to have, some rapport with them. So I suppose my follow-up question to that is the submission data, because you report that, don't you?
No, I would love to. I wish the submission data is. That's one of the ways that PSA is now sort of evolved their social media story is that they're doing submission oriented posts.
Maybe
I don't
I'm
have
getting
any
confused
visibility
on that.
into it,
Maybe I saw it from PSA. Yeah. Okay.
which is great, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
love that. I'm glad that they at one point were trying to do the exact same thing I was doing, which is great too. I don't mind. Like if it comes from the source, even better.
Yeah.
But they actually
True.
shifted gears for instead of reporting on what's been graded to what's coming in the door, which is great. I mean, I
Yeah.
love that. And I hope this sort of like lends itself to more companies doing that.
Yeah.
I'm doing this as a service to the industry because I think it's important data to have, but I also am not afraid of the companies themselves, releasing this data. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't do anything as far as submissions. I don't really have any visibility into it. There's nothing made public around it, and so it's just there's a world where maybe I went to like group submitters and started to sort of collect information that way. But as of right now, I don't have any visibility into what's submitted.
Yeah. Interesting. So PSA have pretty publicly said that their backlog has been cleared now. Do you have
Yep.
any idea about other grading companies where their backlogs at? So the one that's particularly in the forefront of my mind now is BGS. Like,
Yeah.
what's happening with BGS? Because that just seemed like such a mess. What happened with them?
I know it's so interesting, and I think Beckett is like so it's such an important brand that people have such a conflicted relationship with it. Like there's a lot of people that have invested in the Beckett brand over years, right? So there's like an installed base of slabs that people own. So
Yeah.
people have this bias or sort of rooting interest for Beckett to be relevant, right? They don't
Yeah.
want to see their slabs become devalued. Um, Candidly, they were just they're I don't they weren't a lot of. I mean, look, PSA did a lot of work to sort of play catch up themselves. To your point, they had a massive backlog. They had the fortunate sort of timing of having a change in ownership that had a very different mentality around. We're not a dividend paying public company, but we're going to invest in growth. We're going to sort of change the look and feel of the company to be more technically oriented, and in the process, we're going to be a lot more consumer centric. And you could argue there's still a lot of room for improvement there, but they've made a lot of strides. I mean, turning an older culture around there where the incentives were not to grow fast and sort of be innovative into something that is definitely like pushing the boundaries of that now. That's 2 years in, and they've sucked out a lot of talent in the industry too in the process.
Yeah.
They went to everybody. They were smart in that they knew that they were going to have a hard time finding people who had an understanding of the card market that they could hire, and they were really quick to sort of poach a lot of people across a lot of different facets.
In a time
Um,
when there's a worldwide skill shortage too.
Yeah.
right.
Like, you talk to anyone who's got, a moderate amount of skills at the moment, it's the perfect time to jump ship and get a promotion and, more cash in your pocket. Like,
Yeah.
and that in itself is amazing, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it is. It was a great time for them to do that. One where remote work was really sort of rising, and then obviously like if people can combine their passion and sort of their work, that usually is a pretty productive combination. And so that's an offering that PSA was making to a lot, and Collectors Universe was making to a lot of potential employees. So to answer your question, PSA spent a couple of years doing that, while Beckett was still sort of figuring out. They were still under sort of the old school mentality of they were owned by private equity. They had very different mandates. They were not necessarily charged with how do we sort of capture this sort of groundswell of new collectors that are entering the hobby. It was more just
Yeah.
like, how do we do what we're supposed to be doing and not fall too far behind? And they made some
Mm.
decisions that led to them sort of not being as available as other grading companies. And then I think they've come to realize now that, okay, yeah, we did sort of miss the window and we've lost share in that moment. And they're recalibrating, but they're just 2 years behind sort of the timeline that other companies sort of saw happening or unfolding ahead of them. And so they're playing catch up, and operationally, it's hard when you have an older school mentality around incentives that are geared towards just don't break things. When you're sort of trying to reinvent yourself, that's a hard sort of shift to make, and they're in the process of doing it, but it's coming with a lot of growing pains in the process.
Yeah, so did you see their social media video recently, how they were trying to portray themselves as like these crazy salesmen doing like the discounts? Like that really did come off as the old man in the room. And then my other sort of thought about BGS, we're segueing hard here, but
That's all right.
I think because they shut down, you really had, if you had a big card,
Yeah.
you had to send it to PSA. So then there was this 6-month period where any big card that got graded, it was in a PSA slab. So I think that really self-perpetuated the entire situation to then sort of further extend PSA's lead, because you saw all these amazing cards in,
Right.
in PSA slabs. And I think for me, that's probably not the unrecoverable moment, but I think that for me, that's when I really realized how, deep in a hole that BGS was, and that, will they ever recover from it? And so
Right.
watching your grading stats, this is something that I want to, discuss with you. We might as well lead into this now. So I really like watching your grading stats, because I have been waiting for BGS to come back and, seeing how much catch up they're going to play. But it really does seem at the moment that, there's these other grading companies that maybe have taken their spot. And, what's your feeling, around that? Do you think that they ever will catch up again? Do you think that, SGC is going to hold that place, maybe in perpetuity? Or
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's funny that just to close the loop on, or sort of like close the discussion on BGS too. I mean, like the
sorry, yeah,
story.
we've segued pretty hard. That's okay.
No, it's great. It's all related, but I think like the BGS story is very interesting. They don't do themselves any favor, to your point. Like they've been pretty quiet on social media until recently. They haven't had much of a presence there.
Yeah.
But when I look at the data, last year they were up 30%. So it's not like they're dead. They were still up year over year. It's just the perception is so challenged because they don't say much, and they are doing less volume, and their growth is less significant relative to the other players in the hobby. But there is some argument to the quality they receive is still pretty strong. They're just not playing in sort of like where a lot of the hobby gravitated over the last couple of years, and so there's a reason to believe that they're doing decent, right? But they're just not sort of capitalizing on some of the emerging trends around sort of more liquid cards and things like that.
So in the last 3 years, have Beckett still had growth in their company?
They have, yeah. At least I think they might have had. They might have saw 1 year where it was down 5 or 10% according to grading data that we track. But I mean, generally speaking, they've had up years throughout most of it. It's just
That's really interesting. It's like the sort of the public or my own perception to that, and then to actually see the numbers where they've still had growth. That's actually
it's just, I guess, PSA and Co have sort of exploded, whereas BGS have just sort of ticked along. And I think as part of reinventing themselves, they've got to really embrace the quality over quantity perception. Like they've got to embrace the fact that they've got the quality, and that's literally all they've got left. So if there's no quality and there's no quantity, they're going to become irrelevant. But I mean, we talk about a BGS black label being the cream of the crop because they're so rare. Now that already sort of shouts out that there's a quality thing there, and that they can really use that to reinvent themselves and push as they push back into the market. But it's the low volume, I suppose, that sets off alarm bells.
Yeah, and I think, look, I mean, they have had a hard time staying relevant too. I mean, they not only were they closed, they were basically unavailable. Like you couldn't you didn't hear anything from them. You couldn't get a hold of their customer service team if you wanted to. So it's just like people were so frustrated that they felt like, okay, we had this great company that's sort of no longer participating. What do we do about it? And it did. It lend itself to SGC stepping up. CSG has made a much bigger presence. It has a much bigger presence in the market. I mean, granted, they're new, and so but they're a very viable option now at this stage. What that means for the future is very interesting. I think Beckett is going to invest. I think that they have to sort of consider it an investment though. Like, not everything, they came from this world where everything has to sort of be immediately profitable. And now that's like,
Yep.
okay, we need some things that are going to be loss leaders. We need to sort of invest in our brand. We need to sort of invest in service. We need to do things that aren't going to sort of just necessarily return instant, dollars back to the
Yeah.
P&L. And so, that's a hard sort of conversation to have internally, but I think they're
Yeah.
sort of
Well,
having that dialogue.
yeah, yeah. We saw it at was it at the National that people were at the new Beckett label. Like there was all the.
Mhm.
It's like that's not what is going to do this for you.
Yeah, I mean, look, they have a lot of things that they have to figure out because the market, while they weren't participating nearly as much as people wanted,
Yeah.
has moved. The 9.5 is a hard thing for people to comprehend at this stage.
Yeah.
And the pricing tools aren't oriented around it; they're not oriented around subgrades, right? And so the
Mm-hmm.
things that were their strength is now sort of a headwind for them in the sense that they just have to sort of explain what they're doing and why they're doing it, and the market may have moved on them. They may have to sort of
Yeah.
reevaluate things like their grading scale.
Yeah.
And yeah, to your point though, people were so frustrated in that it's like you guys have to get the blocking and tackling right. We don't want to hear about your vault. We don't want to hear about video game grading. We don't want and unfortunately, I think that's when you have to say it's the story you have to tell when you're like, why weren't you participating? It's like, oh, we were rethinking what we were doing, but it's like, no, you have to get your like core
Yeah.
down
Yeah.
and I think they know that now, but I think there was
They did
a
miss the
shift.
boat. They missed the boat on the COVID spike. That's literally. I mean,
Yeah.
there's another term for poop in the bed. We'll say anyway. They did. They literally went to sleep through COVID, and it's cost them. I've got a few 9.5s of my own in my collection, and I just hope that it sort of doesn't disappear into the sunset. I think there is a place for Beckett, and I think it's very interesting with the amount of TCG cards. Russell and I spoke about this earlier. The way that CCG or CSG has come up and become a
Right.
player, and that's because they found a specialization in the hobby by going, oh well, no one's really a specialist with trading cards. Bang, there's our niche,
Right.
and really sort of doubling down on that. Isn't it?
Yeah.
Charizard's been graded more than Jordan, something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. No, it's I'm not close enough to that market. I'm spending a lot of time in that market now because it's so prolific as it
Yeah.
relates to just like being
You
creative. But
can't
it's
ignore it. It's
no,
massive. Yeah.
Yep.
it's massive, and I can't figure out though if it's sort of just a lagging bubble like we saw with sports cards here, and that that
Mm.
there's going because I can't figure out who's going to take on all these graded cards, but there's so many TCG cards that are being pumped through the system right now, and it's
It's
not the
yeah.
same investor profile. A
Mm.
lot of these cards, the significant majority of them are the equivalent of base cards that are $50 to $100
Mm-hmm.
in a gem mint condition, and so.
Bizarre.
It's not a super lucrative market, but it's a high volume market. So it's really fascinating, but it's clearly there's a ton of momentum there. So I've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out like what the heck is happening and sort of how sustained that bump is going to be. But yes, it's
Yeah.
carrying a lot of the activity. I mean, you look at it's 35 to 40% of what PSA is doing. It's 50% of what Beckett's been doing. That's
Yeah.
kind of helped keep them afloat over the more recent months.
Yep.
Yeah, but anyways, I think the grading landscape. The biggest thing I think competition's good, and I do think like this is beneficial for everybody, and that everybody's had to sort of challenge their pricing models again, sort of question their pricing models and challenge sort of some of their assumptions.
Yep.
My question I ask is sort of like, how do these companies, assuming pricing sort of gets to the bottom for everybody, how do these companies differentiate themselves? There's angles that you can take with service. There's things you can do with certain specific promotions.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, are there other features? Is there another reason for grading beyond sort of just the perceived value add to a card by putting it into a slab with a gem mint grade or just slabbing a grade on it? It doesn't have to be gem mint.
Yeah.
That's where I think like PSA is advantaged in some ways by their set registry. SGC has differentiated itself with return times and customer service. CSG, to your point, CGC, CSG has sort of some niches that they play in that they're doing really well in. And Beckett just has a good brand, and they've done a lot with autographs. They've done a lot with high end. They don't have the service level issue or sort of the upcharges. That has been a problem with people who submit to PSA. So, anyways, everybody kind of has like small things. PSA has larger things that they can lean into, but it's like, are there reasons to sort of grade beyond sort of value add to the card?
I think the insurance on cards for me is a really big one with PSA. And I
But
if I'm
does grading a card also assist with insurance on that? Like I know in PSA will insure it while they're handling it, but
sorry, what I specifically mean by that is if it turns like the card turns out to be fake, then PSA will actually reimburse you for the the full value of a like legit card. And I think for me, like that's a big thing because I don't have a lot of knowledge when it comes to identifying when a card is fraudulent or if it's been
yeah,
printed in someone's backyard. So I do rely on PSA to make sure that it's an authentic card. So I think for me, that gives me a lot of peace of mind, when I am buying them. So I suppose the thing that's been probably the most scariest for me lately is the fake slabs that have been coming out. And so, where does that leave me when I'm putting so much faith into that slab, I suppose? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, people do put a lot of blind faith into the grading companies, and there's been so much conversation around
yeah.
buy the card, not the grade. But the reality is, there's a lot of discussion around people just buy the grade, and that does put a lot of the burden on grading companies. I do think that's partially why you saw. This is my own theory, but like why you saw GemRate sort of decline over the last year too. You have a lot of new graders who are sort of rounding down, in my opinion, because of the PSA guarantee. You don't want to overgrade because then you're on the hook for cards that are in the market that may not be representative of or grades that are in the market that may not be representative of sort of the score or the quality of the card itself. So, anyways, I think there was some conservative elements. The insurance side of it, though, is a big part of the equation, and PSA is the one that sort of really sort of rallied around that. And so,
Yeah,
it's definitely a point of differentiation for them.
absolutely. Yeah. So tell me about GemRate, some of your achievements that you've had so far, and then some of your achievements that you want to do in the next, say, 12 to 36 months.
Yeah, so we're really big. Okay, so the first 2 years, year one was getting PSA data just in like really good shape, like good quality, reliable information that was, could be used for the reporting that we were doing as it relates to content. But also, one of the things we wanted to do with GemRate was allow people to sort of like replay history, and so we store this data every day. So you can kind of go back, like there's this Amazon Wayback Machine where you can go look back at websites like how they looked like 5-10 years ago, and we want to do that with like population data where you can go look at any set, any card at any given point in time since we started collecting this. And so and you can do that. You can go back up until the beginning of 2021 and see, hey, what did 2019 Prism look like at that point in time, and now what does it look like today, and how has it changed, and sort of how does that look compared to like what we're seeing with 2020 Prism and 2021 Prism basketball, for example?
That'd be great. We could like do a time machine in 10 years time and go, do you remember when there were only 20,000 Zion PSA 10 base cards?
Right. That's it, right? And then 20,000. I mean, it's crazy, and you already see a lot of that now. It's like people have already become a lot savvier,
Yeah.
probably because they hit their wallets and the frustration of just having cards in limbo for so long. But base is definitely not being graded anywhere near the rate it was.
Yeah.
But year one was about PSA. Year two was about how do we bring on the other grading companies, and so that's what our focus was. Like, how do we just make sure that we have reliable data as it relates to all the other grading companies that were sort of major players.
Yep.
And then now our big idea is this universal pop report, and I'm calling it a pop report, but it's just universal grading data.
This
that
is
a lot of
music
people
to my ears.
Yeah, and
I love it.
It's been what we've been working on really since full time since March, which is how do we, every grading company has their own conventions for this data, and it's partially because the manufacturers aren't doing anybody any favors. They don't hand off checklists with images of cards to allow people to sort of, quickly gauge and see what's coming through their doors, right? So they have to sort of on the fly anticipate what's coming, react to it, and so. But everybody has their own sort of interpretation and sort of their own
Except for the checkerboard, that's the only card that's got the parallel written on the back in massive, like, capital
Just
letters.
in case you didn't realize that the checked design on the front was.
That's the most
some-
annoying. Like, that's the most annoying thing. Yeah.
As somebody who's colorblind in this industry, when I'm looking at like illusions, and I'm like, I can't tell you, or chronicles, I'm like, I can't tell you if that's pink or green or what, but it's crazy to me. So I would love if they were written somewhere. But yeah, man, it is tragic for me sometimes to try to navigate all these different parallels.
So practically, how do you tell the color differences on the card?
I can't for some, honestly. I mean, most of them I can. It's not. I'm red green
Okay.
colorblind, and so it's a significant majority of stuff I can see. But when it's like close, I don't know. When it's blends of colors, it's really hard for me to tell.
Yeah. Huh.
And so I literally can't look at like illusions and tell, or chronicles and tell like if it's foil oriented parallels, I can't tell what it is.
Yeah, you
really.
just have to look for the numbering on the back and hope that that sort of connects dots.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which is there's probably some sort of class action suit that's I'm sort of bubbling up here as I discuss this. But some lack of accessibility. But yeah, it's challenging, and there's just so many. I mean, that's part of the fun of it, right? I mean, that's the one thing when I think about like making data more transparent and accessible. It's like you don't want to go too far in this because people love sort of the challenge of sort of acquiring good data, right? There's a lot of hunt. There's a lot of discretion and sort of like the approach you take to like analyzing this industry, and so.
Yeah.
But it's like it shouldn't be so hard that it's prohibitive from doing good analysis, and that's kind of where it was.
Yeah.
But this universal pop report, it's basically like how do we look at a silver prism from one company and make sure that that's basically essentially combined with the silver prisms from other companies, and then present one sort of population so you can see it through the lens of, hey, not only was this graded 10 times at BGS, but it was graded 5 times at CSG, 4 times at SGC, and 26 times at PSA.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I was really frustrated when I came into the market, and I made a lot of purchases, and I'm like, I didn't understand all the nuance. I was very big on a couple players from 2015, and I was like, oh, BGS was like huge in 2015. And if I didn't, I didn't know that. So when people were presenting PSA pops of 2, I didn't know that there was 10 BGS cards also out there because, they were where people were going. And so I was, and if you just look at the way everybody talks about all their cards, it's really through the lens of sellers. It's how the auction houses present the information. It's how people on eBay present the information, which is like pop 1. And it's like, well, no, it's pop 1 if you look at that specific grade for that specific grading company. But I actually don't, I mean, that's helpful, but that's not the whole story. And so I wanted to sort of shift the thinking there to say, okay, well, let's present it for the buyer as well. Like, so
I don't think you're going to change much behavior on eBay, though, to be honest. I think it's always going to be like an eBay 1 of 1.
eBay
or,
1 of 1 is such
rubbish.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
But which is fine. The sellers can do it, but I want to arm buyers with a way to quickly gauge.
Sorry.
I suppose that's what we want for our listeners is these kind of tools are the things that the collectors look for. They're like, how do I best arm myself when going into this hobby and looking for cards? I did a little test earlier today because I've got a BGS 9.5 that's numbered to 10, a Kobe. And I went onto GemRate and I looked for it, and it was because it only had the PSA data. It's like it's been graded 5 times and it's never been above PSA 8. And I'm like, well, I've got a BGS 9.5 of it. I know that's pop 2. So like I could just go never been graded over a PSA 8. Look, this is a 9.5. This is how rare it is. But there's another one that's very similar in the group, and I think a universal pop report where it sort of gives some perspective to the collector as to how rare a card actually is, or how rare the condition of that card really is very useful.
Yeah, that's the hope. And so the reason I hedge against Pop Report initially with my sort of presentation of that is I'm not really building it yet into the site. It's more of how I'm building it into partners right now. So the data exists, and that's how I started working with Card Ladder and working with Card Hedge, which is how can I sort of supplement what they're doing and deliver it in the way that they sort of store their data as it relates to cards, and allow people to navigate it with pricing tools, for example. But there's a world, and I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but like, I the way I view this is like, GemRate doesn't need to be a destination. I actually want this data overlaid where you're sort of collecting, right? And so that's why I want to work with data tools. But like, there's a world where you go through eBay and we have a Chrome extension, and you can just sort of hover over a card and see the universal pop report for it, right? And like that's what we want to work towards, which is like, you could be on MySlabs, you could be on any marketplace, you could be on any auction house. Ideally, we work with a lot of them, but if we don't work with them, then we'll overlay it so that you can see it. But the idea is like when you're actually in the mode of trying to add to your collection, or at least evaluate what's out there, that you can see the full picture. And so that's kind of like the idea of the universal pop report, but it's more of a distributed pop report than it is like a central place to go to sort of, I mean, we're building that as well, but that's a lot harder of a problem in the sense of like just a lot of data, and how do you present it in a way that sort of allows people to, cut and slice it in different ways that also is just like not overwhelming.
Yeah, because there's a lot of overwhelming data for those that haven't sort of delved. But it's just good data. The more information you have at your fingertips as someone that doesn't know a lot about cards, it sort of makes it easier and less daunting, I guess, or more daunting. It depends.
You just said four massive things and just kind of skipped over them like it was absolutely nothing. So I just want to just draw us back a little bit to what you just said then. So you said that you're working with Card Ladder. So tell us about that, because that's a massive
Yep.
achievement to be going to partnership with them. And then the other thing too is that you said earlier in the piece that you were working, by yourself for 2 years, and on Raymond Lee's interview, you also said that you self-funded that. So I think you need to sort of congratulate yourself here a little bit, and acknowledge like the achievement you've had. And I mean, I want to acknowledge your achievement. I think this sort of love child, for lack of a better word, is really becoming something that's important to the hobby. So yeah, like, reflect on that sort of statement if you could.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I'll start with sort of the 2 years. I mean, that's part of the advantage that I had, is I knew this couldn't really be like a hobby for most people. Like, I poured a lot of money into this because I just thought it was sort of necessary to get it off the ground. Data is sort of expensive to acquire in a lot of ways, and when you build a data product, it takes time before the value is really there. You kind of have to have it for a little bit of, you have to have a little bit of a history before it becomes valuable.
Yeah.
And so I was placing a bet that there would be a way to monetize it. And candidly, I was thinking about like B2C as an option, but it's a pretty frugal hobby. Like, people want to make sure their dollars are going towards their cards, and they're not necessarily like super excited about spending money on a lot of tools. I mean, they'll maybe spend money on one or two tools here and there, but it's not like a hobby that's ready to go pay $100 a month for tools to help them navigate
Definitely
the
not.
card link.
Yeah.
Right. And so I sort of quickly became aware that that was going to be the case, and I just started thinking about how can I actually get this data into the hands of users where they're going to want to use it. And so one of the ways was building an API. And so I spent the better part of a year building out the infrastructure to deliver this over an API. And the hard part is, not only is it different with each grading company, but each tool has its own sort of way that they store data, because there's just not a lot of standardization there. So it's like, how do we match the way that a Card Ladder stores their data to the way that GemRate stores their data, or CardHedge is another partner of ours. How do we match it with their data? Or we have other partners that are sort of soon to be announced that store their data differently. So it's just, how do we sort of give them our data in a way that matches what they're doing? And so it took a long time to sort of build out that infrastructure, and even the Card Ladder conversation. It was faster than expected in a lot of ways, because I was working so closely with Josh at Card Ladder on building out like the ideal way to deliver this information. But it's one of those things where they realize, like, look, we're doing the same thing that you're doing with pop reports, but it's not our core focus, and we'd rather just pay you for the data and partner with you in that sense, and take that off our hands, and it'll be better data because you have data that's aggregated across all grading companies, right? And so it's sort of a win-win. And as it relates to the grading companies, it's one less company that's going and pinging them for data to sort of do the same thing. So it sort of removes another player in the market that was going to them, asking them for data in a way that is just not always ideal for them. And so the idea with Card Ladder is, though, exactly that. It's like, just how can we sort of integrate it into their tool so that through the lens of how Card Ladder presents data, you get a more rounded out picture of not only sort of the pricing landscape, but you can see it across all the different grades. And so right now we're doing it just for cards that are verified on Card Ladder right now. Because that's where they have the most data. That's where they have that's where they're putting their stamp on, this is verified pricing, sales data. You can be very confident in what we're presenting here. And so that, it took 6 weeks to sort of build out that partnership. But I was really excited about it, just because, again, they have such, people have such a high opinion of what they've done. They're very well known or well regarded for having really high quality data. And so being able to pair our data with their data was really important.
And they're also part of the PSA investment group, aren't they too?
Yeah, they're a Collectors Holdings company as well. So which is great. I mean, it's the more that companies, it took me a minute, I think, when I came into the market, as far as like, they're like, what is this guy doing? Is this a project? What is he trying to sort of infiltrate what we're doing with pop reports? And it's like, no, I'm not. Why is he releasing numbers? I think there was some skepticism early on around just like, who is this guy? What is his intentions? And really, it was to be additive and sort of just add more transparency. But it took a little bit of time for companies to see, like, no, I'm not trying to blow up. And this is not some sort of like way to go behind the scenes and sort of try to unveil or sort of surface
A new grading
I don't
company
know,
or something.
conflicts. Yeah, it was really good intentions, but it was, there's just a lot of unknowns, and data has been pretty closed off in this hobby for a long time. There's not a lot of partnerships. There wasn't a lot of willingness to sort of share, and so it's just different. And so it took me a little bit of time to build up momentum there.
Yeah.
And I think now that I've been doing it for so long and sort of stayed true to sort of the vision and the mission for this, people are now have well received it. But it's to the point of Card Ladder. It's nice to be able to work with like a collector's company because that is PSA's sister company, right? And so it's nice to be partnering with them, and in some ways now having a relationship with collectors informally, which is just something that may not have been on the table a year and a half ago.
Yeah. I actually think it's interesting from an external, like just looking at the process that you've gone through, seeing someone come in and say, I don't want to be the main platform. I want to add value to other areas of the hobby. You're like, I just want to be a background addition that helps everybody. Like you collate all the data for the grading companies. You're giving information that collectors are screaming for. The ones that are serious about spending money want to know the pop reports, want to know what they're investing in, and this kind of data sort of ticks all those boxes. And I think it's a very unique product. And as I was joking before, it's something that I'm like, why doesn't somebody try and collate everything? And it's a lot of data and a lot of different platforms, and I get that, but if we can get all that information, it just makes it so much more transparent as far as mitigating risk, not getting fooled by sellers and those poor hobby experiences that we're all scared of.
Right. Yeah, there's agreed. And I think it's still early in like what we want to do even, this universal pop report, one of the things when you're a small startup like this, you have to be focused, but I have so many areas that I want to go into that I'm not there yet, but I mean, like, a lot of people use GemRate today for like discovery. Like they're like, oh, I have a player in mind. I want to understand sort of their universe of cards, and I want to use GemRate to sort of as a jumping off point to just be like, what exists their rookie year? What are other sort of cards that are sort of popular for this player? What are, and then people start to get to the next set of questions of like, oh, what are some, cards that are sort of lower pop that might be also scarce in the sense that there's demand for them, and that's one of the things that is harder to triangulate. And ideally though, like I want to build like sort of, I say like the Elias Sports Bureau, but like basically like, or StatMuse for like population data, which is like, you can ask any questions and like say like, hey, I'd like to see the population reports for NBA Hall of Famers. And I'd like to see all their cards that have been graded, or have less than 10 Gem Mint cards available. And like, across all grading companies.
A Gem Mint card, that is a very specific category, isn't it? It's, I'm just trying to go off memory. It's BGS 9.5. and above, PSA 10. So effectively the 9.5s and 10s amongst grading categories.
Yep, exactly. And that's kind of like, because there's so much data, we've really oriented around the Gem Mint grades. But I mean, we'll present a world where you can go deeper into all the grades eventually. But again, we're not trying to siphon traffic away from existing pop reports until we're ready to sort of like fulfill something greater and sort of something that's, additive. We just haven't done it. But yeah, I mean, ideally, you could ask anything of this data set, and we want to kind of build instead of like an industry, I mean, like a business intelligence tool. That's where a lot of my background was working with like a lot of like data visualization and reporting. I'd like to bring that instead of being internal facing, though, like external facing, so that people in the hobby could sort of ask questions of this data and in a self-service way and answer them in any way they want.
The trading card version of ChatGPT. It'll be go through, ask it to give you a recommendation of a player. And it'll go based on population reports. Here's your here's who you're investing in.
Yeah, I mean, look, if I don't move fast enough, I may miss the boat. They may just sort of jump over me, and ChatGPT will just sort of.
That's some insane data mining, isn't it?
They're probably listening to what we're saying right now, so
they're
it's possible,
always
right?
listening, aren't they?
Yeah.
I had a look at it, just some of the filtering that you can do on GemRate. And like going to, I suppose, using terms that we use on the show, to discover a player with, come on, Russell, your favorite term, the Faruja factor.
Yeah.
Like current hype. I just had a quick look through, and the last month, people have been really upping their Cade Cunninghams, which we've talked about. With the injury, it's like, this is the perfect time to send Cade off to PSA. and the data is actually showing that. Everybody's starting to grade Cade Cunningham, and it's interesting to see player movements. And I
That's
suppose
actually quite clever of people too, just
you
to
can
get it
spot
graded basically
what's
at a
being
discount.
sent to PSA, so you can see what's either being predicted as hyped or what is popular as far as the grading numbers. Doesn't mean the player's going to be sold everywhere. It's just that everybody's getting it graded, kind of thing. It's interesting how you can, I suppose, interpret the data. That's the word. But trends.
Yep. Yeah, and there's definitely ways that, I mean, I haven't, the site is still very amateur in the presentation right now, just because it's not my forte, and it's not my focus in the current sort of world of trying to build out this API. But there's a lot of cool things that sort of the trend data will yield around just like, one, to what volume are you seeing around certain players, and then specifically like with 2021 Prism, for example, you can just quickly understand like, hey, which of these parallels are being graded, and within that, then, and one of the things that I really wanted to do is I was really just fascinated by the parallel sort of equation, is which parallels grade better than others, for example. And what that immediately says to me are there things that are sort of underappreciated, or sort of or gemming at higher rates than typically you might see, which just means like, oh, maybe I'll collect a few of these, and for flipping purposes, I might pick a couple of those up and turn them into 10s and move them. Or there's cards where it's like, oh wow, it's really hard to gem this card, so if I see one, I need to jump on it. And so there's like things like that. Then you see these weird pockets with the GemRate data of like, oh wow, everybody's grading this SI for kids, Weminyama card all of a sudden, and it's like, okay, that, like, how material is that, right? And like, you'll see that much faster than you'll sort of see it on the market, and so you can kind of get a sense for like how real or material certain trends are. But you see like all these oddball pockets too, of like people making plays on sort of like cards that you wouldn't expect, because they're just like, oh, it's sort of a card that sort of slipped under the radar. But yeah, the trending stuff is really interesting, and I hope to sort of present it in a way that just makes it a lot more user friendly, because I do think it's really interesting. Like, there's a world where GemRate will have alerts, and you could put alerts on certain cards and be like, oh, how many cards have been graded, and you can sort of get updates on them, right? And that could be a feature that we would launch at some point in the future.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of collectors out there in I suppose my boat, and when you've got access to data like this, you play with it and you go, I wonder what happens if I go down this rabbit hole, and you look up a player or you look up a year, and when you're talking about so Prism, and we're not going to knock them too hard, but their quality control with their releases sometimes has been questionable with the centering. But you can find years like that where you go, oh, it's really hard to find a lot of gem mint, whatever the silver prism rookie is.
17, 18, the green prisms. If you can get a 10 of that, that's just really tricky.
And that's the thing, like finding trends like that where you go, well, there's not many of them, and then you just got to find someone from that draft class, I guess, to sort of zero in and capitalize or take a punt.
Yeah. And the challenge you have too with the way that data has been presented historically, it's just not easy to sort of compare it across sort of other parallels, or even to zoom out and look at like all green, parallel, green prisms for 2017. It's just a hard thing to do. And so that was sort of like one of the use cases GemRate does sort of fulfill today without having to work too hard, is just allow you to see that, because it could be pretty gnarly to try to do that on the existing pop reports. So we do have like an opinion, like we want to help you navigate the parallel landscape much better than you could on like the sort of core pop reports.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things you touched on before, again, you like really quickly skipped over this, was about when you put your mouse over it and it actually will tell you the data, automatically up on your screen. And I'm saying this in a, I'm not saying it in a critical way, but in a somewhat sort of constructive way. I think your data is really, really important, and it is going to become part of the hobby. And I think the way that you integrate that into other apps, I think that's going to be sort of like, how successful, really you become. Because I think the way that currently the website is set up, it's more catered to a very particular group of people who will sort of spend that time essentially, filtering or, sifting through that data. So I suppose my next question is a little bit two parts, is like, and you've already answered that question a little bit, what do you see in the future in terms of, are you going to be developing apps, for phones, or, where do you sort of see your, company going? And the next thing, if you could, would you be able to give us a like a sort of a really quick demo of a key function to your site that people could just go on and use it in a really effective way?
Yeah, sure. So as it relates to sort of like the focus or sort of, I mean, I agree. Like that's our very much our focus is sort of like how do we again be additive. And so like right now it seems because we don't have pricing information, nor is it sort of in our vision for like the near term future or even the medium term future to have pricing data. There's an incompleteness to our data, right? Like you can't answer that next set of questions when you're looking at GemRate data. Like, oh, this is low pop. What does it cost, right? Or what do I have to pay to acquire that card? And so being able to distribute that information to pricing tools is really important to us. Being able to make it available to auction houses is really important to us. And
Was
candidly,
that
it
part
allows
of
us
your
to not have.
partnership with Card Ladder?
Yeah, it's delivering sort of this universal pop report information to them. It's not exclusive to them, though, in the sense that other companies could acquire that same information. It's just how they present it is up to them. And they have a really great presentation that they can tuck that into.
Yeah.
Um, and which is to their advantage, right? They were able to sort of do that a lot faster than a lot of companies would be able to.
Yeah.
But that's kind of like the way that we envision this is that, it's an API that you can acquire from us. And, it's not something that you could just get from the grading companies themselves. The big value add, again, because, we wouldn't release it if we're just doing something that PSA could do and then either eliminate us or, that we're sort of taking away business from PSA. The value has to be that we're combining it across the different companies and presenting it to you in sort of one uniform through the lens of one uniform presentation for a singular card. And so that's now available. We have over 200,000 cards that are sort of qualified right now for that information. Our goal is to bring that to over 1 million this year, which is basically like the majority of cards that matter at this stage.
Yeah.
And you could even argue that the 200,000 covers the significant majority of cards that matter right now. But yeah, that's like a main goal for us. Is to just figure out a way to integrate it into other tools, essentially, because they've already done a lot of the legwork of acquiring a lot of customers, helping them think about collection management, right? And we're not trying to sort of train people on new behavior. We're just trying to present information that is helpful and additive to the existing experience. That's hard to come by, and population reports historically has just been a hard data set to come by.
Yeah.
And then to talk about the feature question, I mean, there's two things that I think, if you were new to GemRate, I think one is, I have not done a great job of sort of advancing the presentation of this, but there's like this in asterisk, there's a search in the nav bar, which will allow you to do basically like our initial version of a universal pop search, which is just like,
I had to play
like
with this. It was great.
I mean, it's very amateur, and even the way I present it, I'm using a technology to sort of embed into the site. It's not consistent with like the rest of the very like basic format that we have. And like you could clearly see, like I'm not a designer, but you could type any card and sort of, if as long as you give it enough information, you can effectively get back how many of that card exists across all the grading companies, and with a little bit of a distribution chart around the grades. And that's kind of like the window into like what we really envision as far as like, okay, this is what you would get. But like now we're doing the work of guaranteeing, or at least like trying our best to sort of, maybe not guaranteeing, but with some assurance, presenting the information as accurate as possible and sort of doing the work to verify that, certain cards are matched appropriately across all graders. Right now, when you do that on site, if you typed in, for example, if you typed in like a 2019 Zion Silver Prism, you'd get back good results because, there's a lot of those graded. And the way that we wrote this algorithm, it's pretty easy to decipher. But if you were to type in like a Pop 3 BGS card that only has, serial number to 5, you might get inconsistent results. Like it'll show you a result for SGC and for CSG that won't even exist, which basically means like there's none that are out there. It'll give you back, like we don't default to, how do I say this quickly? There's no like null. Like we don't determine and say like there's no cards that have been graded at SGC or CSG. We just show you the next closest match, which is not ideal. In a future version of this, though, we'll tell you explicitly like it's there's only been 3 graded at BGS, there's only been 2 graded at PSA, and there's been 0 graded at SGC and CSG. And that's sort of the next evolution of this, which is the hard part of this is telling you when there's none that exist at the other grading companies.
Yeah, right.
The way it exists now, it'll show you what's closest to that. And so it's not perfect, but that's like a good starting point for people who are new to just sort of understand like and ask questions of sort of the GemRate data.
And do you have some instructional videos on YouTube or something like that? Maybe we could link it into the socials for you or something like this?
I don't, but I'm going to put it together today because I've been meaning to do that forever. And I'm just going to create a couple of Loom videos to just like, I've been meaning to throw that up on my own site. And so I might just do that today. And then I'll give you guys a couple links just of like 101s of like, 3 different use cases
Yeah,
because there's,
and again, I'm saying this in the kindest possible way. Like, I think, I'm not, you know, I'm not special or anything
you
like
don't
that,
have to
but
be kind.
yeah, but like, I
Russell
think,
just does this all the time.
no, I just think that, no, I think that, my perception of this was that unless you knew what you're looking for, you know what I mean? I feel like
Mm,
I'm not getting the maximum out of this because I don't know how to do it, I suppose.
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah. And
No, that's exactly right.
Yep.
yeah. And
Agreed.
so,
You have to have a little bit of an opinion to make sense of the way that we're presenting information. And I get a number of emails being like, look, I like the idea, but I don't know where to even start, to your point.
yeah,
And so it's
that's
like,
exactly right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And even
Yeah.
that, lead people into a grading trends page, which doesn't really even set you up to do anything on GemRate itself, like the actual core data. So it's yeah. So to your point, it's like it leaves a lot to sort of be desired still as it relates to like just help me do some stuff on here that could be interesting. And so we haven't really set it up to allow people to do that yet.
I and this is funny because I'm like, well, I got a link to the website and I just started playing. Now I'm a bit different to most people, I guess, but I just went straight in and went, what can I do here? I want to collect football cards today, and went trending players and subjects past week. So I changed the category to football because I don't know anything about the NFL, and I sorted it by weekly change, high percentage. Now, I don't think Micah Parsons is someone I should be investing in, although,
Maybe you should be.
but Aaron Rodgers is the second biggest percentage jump. Then we've got Trevor Lawrence. These are players that I kind of have heard about, and and then I'm like, okay, what looks like, and it might be Micah Parsons might be I don't know if he's been delisted or what, but it says weekly he's up 300% in the number of cards that have been submitted. So there's a trend there, and I'm like, okay, well, he might be someone to look out for if people are selling cards, because people are getting him graded. It just sends me down a rabbit hole. I'm like, I have no idea about football, but I just went and did a search,
Right.
and that's something you can do. I guess for me, I'm like, there's this one place where there's all this data to play with. So let's see what the filters can do. And then I look at basketball and I'm like, oh, look, Jordan, Kobe, LeBron. LeBron's about to break the scoring record and he's up at the moment. Surprise, surprise. But that's where I came up with the Cade information. I'm like, yeah, well, people are getting Cade graded even though he's injured. And that's showing a trend that people are trying to... that a lot of people are prospecting on Cade Cunningham. And I guess you can drill down further on it, onto what cards specifically are being graded, etc.
So, can you give us a NBA hot tip from your data analytics perspective? Like, what's someone that catches your eye from the data?
Oh man, the NBA is interesting. I mean, it's what I really enjoy right now is the 2020 and the 2021 classes are sort of so like they're not baked by any means yet, and so you can see that in like the population reports. Number one, like it's just drastically different than the 2019 landscape, and so you just don't see a lot of cards that have been graded across a lot of the different sets. And within that, there's like no standouts, right? I mean, like sure, 2020 at least you have Melo and you have Edwards that are sort of like established, but now I'm like, oh, Halliburton's an all-star, Max is sort of emerging, big player in the trade deadline, like. Like what are their populations? So one of the actual things I use GemRate for, and probably like the most valuable thing I use it for right now, is I kind of look at like the addressable population, because it's like, okay, LaMelo might only have 50 of these graded, but let's look at Zion and assume that the print runs didn't change that dramatically. Like, where could this go if all of a sudden the grading environment changed? Like, what could we be looking at? Instead of there being 50, Gem Mint, LaMelo Silvers, realistically, there's going to be 3,000 if everything sort of gets fully baked there, right? And so it's like, how do we sort of take what we know today as sort of the environment and sort of extrapolate to like what that could look like if things sort of changed as it relates to like grading trends? And so that's one way that I use it.
So just to interrupt you there, so how do you use that? So that specific piece of data that you're talking about, so does that make you want to submit cards to be graded, or are you saying buy with caution a PSA 10 silver because in the future there will be 10 times more of it? Is that what So just
buy with caution.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's buy with caution. Like I'm trying to present this through the lens of this is where it could go, and that is, very dramatically different than or drastically different from where the market is today. And even though a lot of people know that, you just and things won't necessarily, history won't repeat itself in the way that it did in 2020, in the sense that everybody's grading everything they could because the market was still liquid. But let's assume that it gets halfway there, you can start to figure out there's going to be a lot of cards that still are out there that are in raw form. So that's one of the main things I look at. And then with 2021, you look at it and the Kate thing is even a little bit of a lagging indicator because PSA still doesn't flow things through their system for a month or two, and so that might not even be representative of people still thinking about how his injury is impacting his market. But there's a lot of hype around Jalen Green right now, and then I look at Jalen Green's stats, I'm like, he's still there's so much uncertainty around him. Scotty Barnes has had a rough year. Evan Mobley certainly started to really recently emerge offensively, and so there's not a lot of standouts yet from 2021. So I look at that just to be like, hey, are there different sets where people are grading different cards? And one of the things that I think is most interesting in the era of Panini without having serial numbered cards is you can get a sense for this concept of base rates, which is how many times will I see a base card before I see a silver prism, before I see a tiger stripe, before I see, and you can basically say there's 3,000 base LaMelos, and there's only been 20 tiger stripe LaMelo ball graded. You can kind of figure out what the print run is in rough ways. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a base rate in the sense of just how frequently are we seeing these things, or sort of how frequently might we see these. And so that's what I'm using it for, more of the recent sort of classes of the NBA, just to figure out okay, well, there's still a lot of honest, not much has been established as it relates to the key players and the key sets. Just helping me navigate the landscape, because I do think actually in many ways it's a great time to be participating because there's a lot of unknowns. And so if you can kind of have an angle or sort of an opinion on certain trends that are sort of either emerging or sort of just underappreciated, then you can take advantage of them in ways that maybe people aren't seeing.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing. I'm looking at the trending players at the moment for the NBA, and I've got you, as you said, Mobley, Franz Wagner is another one that's up. Tatum's at the top. Yep. He's weekly changes. Tatum's they're up 182%. The number of Tatums graded in the last week. So, and that's from the prior week, right?
Yeah, it's compared to the prior week. That's right.
Yeah. So Tatum's on a run. Again, Josh Giddey and LaMelo Ball surprises me, being up the percentages, saying he's up 136%. More cards are being graded. That means there are waves of cards being graded, and he's been injured. So I feel like there are waves for reasons.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because I don't have full color on why, but it just takes one person. You could have one person move a market with this data on a given week. If somebody goes and they're a mellow super collector and they're like, oh, I'm going to grade 200 of my mellows that I've been sitting on, that dramatically changes sort of the perception for the shape of the mellow market. And so it's interesting, but
that actually makes sense though, doesn't it? Because if he's injured and his prices are down at the moment, then they're probably saving a couple $1,000s by doing that.
Yeah, true.
Potentially, right? And you don't know. I mean, it could be. It's oftentimes just that. It's one group submitter who has a big, LaMelo collector in it that's just finding a way to sort of grade it as cheap as possible, and that sort of works its way through the system. But it could also be the other side of it, which is just there's an emerging sort of momentum. It's probably not that, given what we just talked about with LaMelo, but I mean, a lot of times it might be.
And how well Edwards is playing now too. So did you see that his 3-point shooting makes is the most ever for a person that age? So ahead of Steph Curry, ahead of Luka.
Who's that? Anthony Edwards.
Yeah.
Wow.
Interesting. So that team is tricky.
I was gonna say a train wreck, but anyway.
They're six in the West.
Chemistry experiment gone wrong.
But they're 6 in the West, aren't they? Who would have thought that the Kings would be 3rd and the Wolves would be 6? I would not have picked that.
Up is down, black is white. Yeah. Who knows?
I'm a chaos junkie, so I like the NBA like this, where there's sort of no clear sort of standouts now, and so it's pretty fun. I'm a Cavs fan, so I'm I'm cautiously optimistic. We're still a little. We need to.
You should be
things up a lot.
You should be very optimistic. I think that team is really well built. Yeah.
They've got a lot of potential. They're still short a couple pieces, I think. But anyways, at least in this NBA, it's like it is. It's anybody's game. Like nobody anticipates, I think, the Kings making a deep run, but it's fun to see them at least in the mix. And it's like,
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Mike Brown has historically been trashed as a head coach, so it's nice to see him as a.
Well, specifically as an offensive coach, and now they're
Yeah,
like
true.
one of the best offensive teams in the league. Like that to me is, I would never have picked that coming in a million years. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Hey, you said about Cleveland need to add some pieces. What do you think that they need to bolster their team?
Well, so I'm like a big Okoro fan, which is like I'm probably in a camp of five. But the reality is they are just like really in need of a 3-and-D wing player, which is a lot of teams in the NBA could say that they're just such a tough to come by um, player at this stage, but they're short. Levert is a weird fit. I like Levert. Like they have a lot of similar minded players in the sense of like they work hard. They're sort of like overachievers in a lot of ways, and like
Yeah.
Levert is that, like Okoro is that in some kind of ways. But they need somebody who's a little bit purer of a shooter that can also play some defense. So I don't know if they're going to move somebody there. And like Jetty Osman, I like, but he's like one of these sort of inconsistent players. Kevin Love's now out of the rotation. Rubio I actually really like, but their bench needs another player, and they also need somebody on the wing that can hit shots. And of course, he shot 50% from three in January, which is like people are somewhat shocked by that. So he's shown some potential there, but he's really inconsistent still. So they need something, but they don't have a ton of assets either. So they're not like sitting there with a ton to move. They'd probably have to move Levert or Okoro to pick up anything, maybe with a pick attached.
Yeah.
I don't think they're going to get much back for Okoro. And the funny thing about Okoro, if you look at his minutes profile since he's come into the league, he's played a lot of minutes. So it's not for
Right.
like lack of opportunity for this kid. So it's so fun, isn't it, that you'd almost argue like their season sort of rests with him. Like that's such a strange sort of position to be in. But how good has Mitchell been for them? And I think Mobley's been amazing. Garland has like way exceeded expectations, and I really love Cleveland. I think they're such like a good team to watch. So yeah, that's
It's
yeah.
No, they're interesting. I went to both playing games last year. I went to the game in Cleveland and I went to the game in Brooklyn, and they're fun. They were fun to watch last year. Now they're
Yeah.
the slowest playing team in the NBA with Mitchell, but Mitchell is phenomenal. I mean, he's like the alpha that they definitely needed. Like Darius Garland is great, but he's not the guy to like step in there and be like, this is my team and this is my way. Like we're in, give me the ball at the end of the game.
Yeah.
He'll do it, but he was sort of like an unwilling, and like I listened to like Russillo and some of these guys talk about it. Like he's just like that's not his mentality. He's like a truer point guard than that, and so it's been nice to have Donovan Mitchell come in and, he can be a little ball dominant sometimes, but he at least will get his shot and you can be pretty confident it's going to be a decent shot.
Yeah.
He doesn't always settle. But he's definitely like an alpha in a lot of ways. And it's been cool to see somebody come in, and like I have a love hate with LeBron. He brought me a championship and, it was for Kyrie, but it's like, it's fun to see somebody Donovan Mitchell, who seems to be a little bit more of a team player in a lot of ways, that's come in and really just immersed himself in sort of the existing culture and found a good way to fit in, even though, this guy was set on going to New York where he's from. Right. And then all of a sudden he gets hoodwinked and has to go to Cleveland, which is not the same by any means. And so, he stepped in and really like took it in stride and done a great job. He's been injured the last few weeks, which has been challenging for them. And then, I mean, Mobley, I love Mobley. I'm collecting a ton of Mobley. And like, I have like a couple sets within the 2021 releases that I'm collecting him in, but Mobley, I love. He's just not a focal point of the offense in the last couple of weeks. With Mitchell out a couple games, and you've had some people in and out, Mobley's been getting a lot more attention, and they're feeding the ball out, and he's doing really well with it. I mean, that guy he's got the skills. He just has to sort of build up the confidence, and he still needs to develop an outside shot.
He's a good decision maker.
Yeah.
He's a great decision maker. Yeah. He catches the ball like any big you've seen, which is one of his advantages. He can dribble the ball really well.
Yeah.
And Garland, honestly, he didn't make the All-Star team, and I would argue that his stats are good, but he's been off a lot of this year. His eye injury really set him back. I watched most games, and he definitely has been very inconsistent this year relative to last year, and trying to figure out where he fits in with Mitchell still a bit. But he's so good. I love watching Garland. He's definitely like a team first player. He's trying to figure out when he needs to step up still. Kind of like Kyrie had to do that with LeBron, but it's fun to watch them. I still think they're trying to figure out, hit their stride a little bit. Like, how do they do that? And if they can time it right, they can make a deeper run than I think people expect. But they're still kind of in limbo right now, in my opinion.
Yeah. We'll see what they're like post-trade deadlines. Maybe they can make a move, but yeah, I think they're in good stead. The East is interesting this year.
I think for the next 5 years, you've got a lot to be optimistic about, honestly. I think if you're a Cleveland fan right now, you're just sitting pretty. No, I don't think there's any team in the league that's as well positioned as Cleveland is for the next 5 years.
Except for Sacramento. I'm trying to put the Moz on your team.
Look, I'd personally, if I was a Cavs fan, I'd be frothing right now. I just think it's just super exciting. Yeah,
it's true.
Hey, Ryan,
we're in a good spot. Yeah.
What's that, man? Yeah.
We're in a good spot. Yeah, I definitely can appreciate sort of the process. Yeah, I'm excited for it.
Is there anything you want to talk about before we head off today?
No, this is great. This was a different set of questions than I normally get, which is awesome. And I appreciate you going a little bit deeper on sort of like what GemRate's future looks like, and also just ways that people are taking advantage of it today. No, this is awesome.
Great.
And I am like, yeah, I mean, I know you guys are NBA centric, and like I love that stuff. So the fact that you guys, we just only started touching on the end, but it's like so fun to think about it through the lens of not just like all the GemRate data, but just specifically through basketball, which is a lot of what I sort of built GemRate through the lens of like the current basketball environment. So it's been fun to go a little bit deeper on some of that stuff too.
It's interesting. It's very interesting that we forget at times that there are other sports and cards that are collected.
Well, who would have thought you'd be building a product to satisfy all these Pokemon fans, right? To see like where the Charizards are sitting. Like,
I have a funny story about that I got out of like basketball cards because I could do nothing with them, and got into trading card games. And now I'm like, why would you grade the game, like the cards that you're trying to play with? Like, I come from a Magic the Gathering background, but like there are people like, yeah, I grabbed my my Black Lotus out of its slab.
I don't know what to do with these, but I've got Magic. I've got Pokemon cards all over the place. I'm trying to learn how to play all of them because I'm like so fascinated.
It's harder to play the games when they're in slabs. I can tell you that. It's near impossible. But yeah, like why you would want a game card slabbed is beyond me. I don't know. I guess they've got the same thing in trading card games these days, where you've got that unique parallel collectible perspective. So that's why they want, slab it, get it valued, and then invest, I guess, is the undertone.
We'll see. I'm like, I'm a little skeptical just in the sense of like, I think that's propping up a lot of what's going on in the grading sense right now. And I don't know that it's going to be that sustained. We'll see. Again, I don't know. I'm not close enough to it, but yeah, anyways, it's fascinating because it's dominating. I mean, it's not a small margin either.
Yeah,
it's dominating.
It's like everybody's like, I wonder what grade my, I don't know, Black Lotus is, or my Charizard. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is they come back like with 80, 90% gem rate. So anyways, it's like not like there's a lot of question marks around the grades of these cards too. That's why BGS actually gets a lot, because a BGS 10 or a black label separates you in the trading card space, where when it everything gems at PSA with these trading cards. Yeah. So anyways, it's like, I don't know. I can't make sense of it. But I'm like, that's why I'm skeptical, because I'm just like, I don't know where these land, and if you can't play with them.
If Beckett wants to go our new direction, is going to be black label Charizards and Pikachus. That's it.
This is from a very narrow perspective, but my perspective on Pokemon is that it probably will come down a little bit. Like you're saying, these numbers are a little bit propped up, and I wouldn't disagree with that. Like those numbers are huge, but I don't think it's going to bottom out either, because I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and like it just makes sense that you'd buy kids Pokemon. You're not going to go out and buy them, like a $500 or $800 box of Select Hobby, right? Whereas, you can get packs of Pokemon for kids, at a really sort of accessible price point. And I think, like, they have just printed the absolute life out of Pokemon. Like, there's no like massive inflation on Pokemon boxes or anything like that, like what we had with NBA the last couple of years. So it's very accessible. All the different age ranges, boys and girls will do it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's very, very accessible. So
I don't know where that translates into getting cards graded.
Well, I think
like as
for
far
the,
as kids go, like I'm not criticizing Pokemon. I'm just like,
for the 20s, 30s, 40s,
Yeah.
50-year-old guys who are doing it, then they're, sending off their slabs to, to flip them over. Like, to me, it just makes sense. Like, yeah, I don't know. And remember, Ad, when we went to
I see it. I just don't
EJ
get it.
Cards, like, I feel like there was more people there doing Pokemon than NBA, and
It's just the slabs I
so
don't understand. I just
yeah,
I don't get it.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat though. It's like I'm cautious to not knock something I don't understand, right? I want to make sure I
Sure.
understand it, which is why I have the sets here because I need to start really immersing myself. But I mean, it is interesting, and that's the thing. I think we'll find out.
but I don't collect Pokemon either. But I'm just trying to sort of put myself in that same. What's the difference though? Like of getting like a base Zion graded or a base Lamello to a
Charizard.
Pokemon card. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it's exactly the same thing, just with a different logo
true.
on it.
That's true.
It's harder to speculate though on like TCG, right? Like I don't, there's a lot of unknowns and sort of
Just get them
there's
authenticated
upside
by
potential.
PSA. It's cheaper.
Yeah. I mean, it is. Yeah, I don't know. I do think the TCG thing though, as far as like the GemRate story goes, it's important. So I want to make sure I understand it, and I am careful to sort of like I don't want to question it without doing more research. But it's interesting. I'm just cautious
Yeah.
of like, oh man, this is really propping up a lot of the grading numbers, and I wonder how sustained it's going to be. And
Yeah,
if it goes away, pricing is going to have to get more aggressive, right? Like right now, pricing is catering towards this trend, but I hold on to a bunch of cards still for my PC because I'm just like pricing still has to move downwards. It's just going to have to. So if this TCG slows down a bit, you'll start to see people gravitate more towards sports specials again.
Yeah.
More aggressively.
fantastic. Well, that's good to look forward to. Yeah.
We'll see. Well, thank you guys for having me on. I appreciate it. This has been great.
It's been a lot of
I
fun.
know you wanted to close out the conversation 15 minutes ago, and then I brought up this whole TCG.
No,
thing.
not at all. This is great. This is how we roll, mate. So that's absolutely perfect. And thank you so much for your time. You've been incredibly generous and given us a lot of insights into something that I think a lot of people are going to benefit from. And we wish you all the luck in the world, moving forward, and all the success. And we hope we talk to you again soon.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll see. We'll see a lot of GemRate data all over the place. It'd be great.
Well, I appreciate that, and I've been, like I said, a big fan. I'm trying to figure out ways to throw Delicious and Ferrugia into my dialogue here. I'm still not not natural yet, but when I hear it, I get a nice little chuckle because I really appreciate it. It's definitely it's just fun. I like hearing your guys' perspective on the market, so I enjoy what you guys are doing. So I wish you guys the best as well.
Thanks, you.
Mate. Cheers.
Great. Cheers.